Hey guys! Alright, we're going with full transparency here. This is round 2 of biscuit making 101. First round, and I will post pictures of the first round. First round, I used whole wheat flour and I used coconut cream because that was the plain milk that I had. One, if you use whole wheat flour, be prepared for it not to rise. 2, the heavy cream, or the, not heavy cream, the coconut cream, the flavor is fine, but actually in the interest of transparency, this is round 2 of the coconut cream biscuit. This was one that rose. This was the first batch. See how much, see the rising action that we got going on? It's perfect. But yeah, no, just, so anyway, we're starting over. So what I learned today is that we don't get discouraged when things don't turn out. We just get back in the saddle and try again. So we are going to be making biscuits. I promised you biscuits, so biscuits we shall have. Fingers crossed, prayers prayed that this round turns out. So I had to take a couple of culinary classes when I was getting my family consumer science degree. And we took the courses through DMAC, and one of the labs that we had to do, and they turned out the first time when I did them back then, but one of the labs they had to do was a biscuit recipe. So biscuits are a quick bread, so we're going to talk a little bit about quick breads while I'm doing this today. It's a simple recipe. You'd think it would be easy to execute, but you know, here we go. We'll see. So we're going to read this recipe together, and then we will go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is double check for the temperature that I need to set the oven to, so that while I'm doing all my steps, the oven can be preheating. So first thing on the procedures, it says preheat the oven to 375 degrees. Perfect. So we've got that going. Before I go any further though, I'm going to double check the ingredient list. I'm going to make sure that I have what I need. Okay. So it says I need all-purpose flour sifted before measuring. That's really important, because if we use flour that's unsifted, then we might have too much, which makes our product too dense, which means that it won't rise. So pre-sifted flour, super important. Okay, so when I buy my flour at the store, like this has been tossed around on the truck, tossed around in the store, and tossed up onto the shelf. This has been packed just by the process of getting to where it's going. Okay, so when I measure out my flour, what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure out 2 cups of flour, and then I'm going to sift it, and then I'm going to remeasure it, which sounds kind of like a pain, but if it means that our biscuits don't turn out like this, is it worth it? I'm going to leave it up to you to decide. And we're using all-purpose flour this time instead of wheat flour. That was wheat flour this morning, which totally changes the ball game. Anyway, so we're going to need 2 cups of all-purpose flour, and then we're going to need baking powder. Welcome to my kitchen. Baking powder. We're also going to need salt. So there's our dry ingredients. Then we are going to need, this recipe calls for shortening. You can sub butter for shortening, which we are going to do for me. Butter's better for you. Say that 10 times fast. So we are going to use butter instead of shortening. If you want to use shortening at your house, that's okay. You can go ahead and do that. I'm going to use salted sweet cream butter. Okay. Then we are going to need 3/4 of a cup of milk. So I have bought regular milk to see how that changes the game. And then we will need an additional 1 tablespoon of flour. So now that we know we've got all of our ingredients, we're gonna start getting out our utensils that we're going to need. So we are going to need a mixing bowl. We will need a 1 cup dry measuring cup. So this is a dry measuring cup. This will be used for the flour. Then we are going to need 1 tablespoon of baking soda. So make sure when you get your measuring tools out that you read, sorry, there's a glare, that you read what it says on the handle. Make sure it's got a capital T. If it's TBS, that's tablespoons. If it's TSP, that's teaspoons. And we are going to need 1 teaspoon of salt. So TSP on the spoon. And for comparison's sake, see the difference? It's a lot. 3 teaspoons equal 1 tablespoon. So it will make a huge difference in your recipe if you get these confused. Okay? Then we are going to need a liquid measuring cup, so that's the glass one, for the milk. So make sure you get a liquid measuring cup. And to be accurate, when we measure with this, we're going to measure at eye level. Okay? Then we are going to need a biscuit cutter. If you don't have one of those, you can get your handy dandy protein shaker cup out. This one has a good edge. So we're going to use this to cut out our biscuits. We're going to need handy dandy rolling pin. Don't hit anyone over the head with it. And we will need a fork for some of our mixing. We're going to need a flour sifter, or the recipe says you can use a wire mesh strainer. If your kitchen is equipped with one of those, go ahead and use that. Mine has a flour sifter from IKEA. And then you're going to need a straight edge metal spatula or a butter knife if it's got a smooth edge for leveling. So now that we know our ingredients and we know the supplies that we're going to need, forgetting 2 important things. You're going to need a cookie sheet for our biscuits. And then if we have dough left over, I want to teach you how to make flaky biscuits where they're in layers. And we're going to use a muffin pan for that. So, all right, we are going to begin mixing our dry ingredients. So before we start measuring anything, I got out a piece of wax paper and I'm going to use that to sift my my flour onto before I put it in my mixing bowl. So I'm going to take my flour . We're going to do this. We're just going to take our 1 cup, and I kind of want you guys to get an idea of why it's important that you don't pack the flour. So I just pressed my flour into my cup to kind of help level it off. That would be called packing it. So then I'm going to start with my knife in the middle and push forward, push the excess out, and then middle push back. Okay. So I told you right before I packed it that I don't really want to be packing my flour for the main reason of I don't want to get too much. And the reason I don't want too much is because if I have too much flour, it'll suck up the moisture and it can make my product too dry. It can also mean that my product won't rise properly. Okay, so move some of that just so you can see. So I've got 1 cup of flour. My recipe called for 2. So there's a handle on the side of the sifter. I can pull like that, or since I'm trying to talk to you guys, I can just tap it on the side of my hand. Okay, so what this is doing is incorporating air into the flour, and it's making sure that the flour is not packed and super dense. And since I want my biscuits to be light and fluffy and airy and not hockey pucks, like what I showed you from earlier, I'm going to make sure that I sift my flour. Okay, so there's 1 cup. And now I need to get my second one. So sometimes what can happen when flour gets packed is you can end up with almost double the amount that you are needing for your recipe. And that causes problems, as you can imagine, when you have a product that needs to rise. It's unfortunate if your cookies are dry, but if your cake is too heavy and it won't rise, that's another problem altogether. Sorry, try not to make too much noise because I know the microphone picks up a lot. So, biscuits are what's known as a quick bread in the kitchen. So biscuits, muffins, pancakes, waffles, those are all in the same family of quick breads, okay? And the trick with biscuits is that we want to mix the dough enough that we get, we create gluten, but we don't want to overmix it so that our dough becomes tough and won't rise, because overmixing it can, sorry, hold on. Overmixing it can also cause a product not to rise. All right, so you saw me put 2 cups of flour into the sifter. So now what we're going to do is measure, remeasure, and double check. So the way I like to do this, you take your knife underneath the pile, and you want to make sure that you don't pack it in the cup, that you don't shake the cup down. You just are lightly dumping that flour back into the 1 cup. So I'm sure that you can see why it is that I want to have the wax paper down. So now I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to go middle push forward, middle push back to make sure that the cup is full. Okay, so now I've got my 1 cup. So I'm going to dump that into my mixing bowl. Okay, and now I'm going to get my 2nd cup. You guys, I think I have figured out what might have happened with round 1. So now I'm going to middle push forward, middle push back. Just making sure the whole cup is full. Okay, so that was 2 cups of flour. And then I'm going to just pick, go up and move you closer. Look at that. Look at all that extra flour that's on the wax paper. Wherever you're at right now, why don't you start taking guesses as to how much extra flour is on this wax paper? I'm going to guess that we have a half cup to a full cup of extra. We're at more than a half a cup extra. Oops. All right, at this point, I'm going to take my wax paper. I don't recommend you do this while you're still measuring for your recipe, because the OCD lady in me says this is still kind of condensing our flour a little bit. Oh my goodness, look at this, you guys. Look at that. We had almost an entire extra cup of flour. Yikes. So if we had not sifted that out, and I'm just putting it back in the bag because it's not contaminated with any other ingredients. Wow. So that could have been, since we want our product to turn out, that could have been really bad, right? Okay, so now, just in case this recipe flops, I'm gonna leave my measuring cup over there. Otherwise, I would tell you at home to wash, rinse, dry, and put that away right away. So next I need 1 tablespoon of baking powder, and I'm going to put this into the same bowl. The nice thing about the baking powder container, I love this. I like that it's got a lip where I can just level it off. It's perfect, so easy. So there's my tablespoon of baking powder. And then we are using salted sweet cream butter, and most recipes, they plan on you using unsalted butter, or in this case it's calling for shortening, but we're using butter. So I don't need to do a whole teaspoon of salt because my butter is salted. So I'm actually going to do a little less than 1 teaspoon of salt because of that. So if you were to make these and you were like, nope, these are not salty enough, we want to add more salt, you can do that. Salt is actually for flavor. It's not going to impact our chemical reaction. So there is that. And now we are going to take our fork and we are going to stir those dry ingredients around, because we do not want to have some salty biscuits, some bland biscuits, and some biscuits that rise, and some biscuits that are hockey pucks. Our hope is that we don't have any more flopped biscuits. But you know, we'll just see what happens. And I'm gonna move this over just in case I want to use it on the baking sheet in a minute. So the fork is kind of working like a sifter to help disperse the baking powder and the salt. But our recipe does ask us to sift the flour, the baking powder, and the salt together. So I'm going to keep it all in the same bowl. Actually, we're gonna bring that parchment paper back. Okay. I'm gonna just dump my flour out, my flour mixture, I should say, out on the wax paper. And I don't need to worry about the flour getting packed again because I've already got all my ingredients measured out. So so maybe you can see it a little better. So I've got my dry ingredients on the wax paper. I'm gonna dump them into my sifter, and then I'm gonna sift it back into the bowl. And this is gonna help make sure that the baking powder and the salt are incorporated throughout the whole mixture. And that way I don't have any of those problems I was telling you about just a minute ago. So I'm going to put my sifter in here, and then I'm going to just dump this right into the sifter so I can sift the last of the dry ingredients into the bowl. Trying to minimize my mess. Anyone else like that? Moms say, clean up after yourself, clean as you go. mom used to tell us that. Well, she still tells us that, especially if we're at home cooking. All right, important thing with the sifter, now I've got some flour and stuff on the outside of it. Really tempting, since we are cleaning as we go, right, to just put this in the sink. We don't want to do that because when you mix flour and water, it creates a paste, and that can actually ruin the sifter. So you just take a damp wash rag and you just wipe it off, or wipe it out if you need to wipe it out. And then you let it sit and air dry any of those spots that just got wiped off. So I'm going to set that down. And now I'm going to place the parchment paper off to the side, and we're going to do our liquid ingredients. Okay, so the next thing that our recipe calls for is butter, and it calls for 3/4 of a cup of shortening. So butter is actually measured by the stick. You cut it on the line, so each line represents 1 tablespoon. So we are supposed to get 1/4 of a cup of butter. So this says 4 tablespoons equals 1/4 of a cup. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to cut on the line. And it cheats, and it already tells you that. So we are going to cut on that line. Mine has been sitting out at room temperature for just a little bit, not very long. It's softened a little bit, but you don't want your butter to be melted, because it actually will change the consistency of your product. So the recipe says to use a pastry blender. I don't have a pastry blender, so we are going to use a fork instead. You can use a fork to cut the fat into the flour. You can use 2 butter knives and pull to like chop up the stick of butter. Otherwise, my first year teaching, one of my favorite memories, we were looking at kitchen equipment, and we were identifying like what the names were and like how you use them. And I put a picture up of a pastry blender, and one of my students shouted out the name that they thought it was. And you guys, it is one of the only times in my life I have ever laughed so hard. He shouted out, "Brass knuckles and a whisk," and I just looked at him like he was crazy as I like almost toppled out of my chair. I was laughing so hard. Brass knuckles and a whisk. So if that tells you what a pastry blender looks like, there you go. Typically it has a handle, and then it's got a bunch of wires that connect from one end to the other in a U shape, and then you can hold it by the top and just cut into your fat and your flour, which kind of makes what I'm doing a little bit easier. So maybe after this little experiment round 2, I will invest in a pastry blender. We'll see. But if these don't turn out, maybe there won't be a need to invest in one. So what we're supposed to do is cut our butter into the flour until it resembles rice-like pieces. Okay. So it's not going to completely incorporate all of the like the flour and the fat aren't going to be completely mixed. There will still be some dry pieces. There might even still be a little butter that's unmashed in, and that's okay. But we want to cut the fat in, and then we're going to add the milk to it. And then we want to make sure that we stir and then knead the dough as much as the recipe calls for, so that we can activate that gluten, because that is what's going to be it's going to help trap the air when the CO2 gas is released from the baking powder. It's going to trap that gas, which is going to help our biscuits rise in the oven. So you didn't know that you liked chemistry, did you? I'm here to tell you, food is chemistry, which is kind of cool, because it's a kind of science we can all master. So I'm going to finish mashing this butter in, and then we will add the milk in just a moment. All right, So we have got our butter cut into our flour. And so we are going to push the dry ingredients to the sides of the bowl and make a well in the center. So the thing that we need to keep in mind here as we're getting ready to add the milk in, we're adding more liquid to the recipe. So I'm just going to read you what the culinary cookbook says about gluten. So gluten is a network of proteins that are found in a wheat flour. And so the gluten is formed when the wheat flour absorbs moisture and it gets agitated. So when we mix it or when we knead it. And so then this networking then traps gases inside the batter or the dough, and that causes the product to increase in volume and rise. And then when it's baked, the protein network coagulates, giving strength and structure to the final baked product. So that means it comes together and solidifies in that, giving it the size that it bakes up to. So how's that for learning some new terms? So we need to add 3/4 of a cup of milk. And then if our flour is still too dry, sorry, I only need to mess these up one time. So here's what it looks like to have a well in the center. I don't know if you can tell, but all the dry stuff's pushed off to the sides. With liquid measuring, we're going to measure this at eye level, and we want to be careful. I don't know if you can, I don't think that helps. Okay, so we only need 3/4 of a cup, but you want to make sure you're careful when you're reading, because this says 3/4 of a cup, and then if I keep going up the cup, there's another spot where it says 3/4. However, we have now passed the 1 cup mark, so this is 1 cup and 1/4 cup, 1.5 cups, 1 3/4 cups. So just make sure that you're at the right spot on your liquid measuring cup. And then you'll be able to see me doing this. So we're gonna get down on eye level and make sure that you can see the fill line that you're going to. And we are going to pour that milk until it gets to the 3/4 of a cup line. Okay, so double check, make sure that you have got the right amount. Don't pick it up to check, because that's going to make the liquid move, and that's going to mean that it's not consistent, it's not accurate. Okay, so if this is moving, I can't read it. All right, so then the instructions say that after I push the ingredients to the sides of the bowl, so a well is formed in the middle, I'm going to add the milk and stir with a dinner fork, which I've got. And so we're going to stir vigorously and quickly until blended. So about 10 to 15 strokes, or until the dough starts to form together. So it should be pulling together. All right. And then it says you can add 2 to 3 tablespoons of milk if the dough seems dry. So here's to hoping our dough is not dry. Okay. And before we mix, I'm just going to pick you up and show you again. So you've got all that milk in the middle. All right. Oh, you guys, this is already so much better. Yay! Yay, yay, yay. All right. So we have still got some dry, I can't so you can see. So there it's come together in the middle, and we've still got some dry flour at the bottom. So I am going to add tablespoon. So then your dough is going to start to be tough. And you can see where it's stretching. Those are the gluten bonds that are forming. Which is kind of cool. I don't know, maybe I'm a little nerdy. I think it's cool. All right, so I'm done with my liquid measuring cup, and I actually am going to need my tablespoon. Wash that real quick. Because now we are ready to roll out our dough. So the next step, it says dust the top of a prep table, which is just our fancy countertop here in Miss Baloo's kitchen. And we're going to form the dough into a ball, which it is in the bowl, okay? And then we're going to turn it out onto the prep table and knead it lightly with our fingertips 10 to 20 times, okay? That part's important because remember when we were reading about developing gluten and it talked about how it needed to be mixed and how that's what develops the gluten, which traps the air, which when it gets baked is what causes it to rise up. Yeah, all of that's important. So, and you know what sometimes helps is if you put some flour in your sifter and then dust your countertop. Okay, and that didn't even quite take a full tablespoon, which is nice because then I can come back and grab that again in a minute if I still need it. So, we are going to turn this biscuit dough out on the counter. Yeah. Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm so excited that this is turning out. You have no idea. No idea. All right, we will get this moved back here. All right, it is still sticky, so I'm gonna work in some of that flour that's on the countertop. All right, and it said that I should be working dough 10 to 15 times. So I'm just kind of picking up as much of that flour that's on the countertop as possible. See how that's starting to come together? And it's still a little bit sticky. You don't want it to be sticky. So I'm going to, and this is why you would need to rinse off your flour sifter. I'm going to add some more flour to my counter. And remember, that was still just that 1 tablespoon that was in there. So I haven't really added too much more flour to change this consistency. So can you see how that's changing? It's so much more fun when this stuff turns out the way you want it to. I was joking earlier saying that life is hard. It's like biscuit dough. Like my first attempt. So, all right. Now that we've gotten that, we're probably getting close to our 10 to 20 times. Okay. So it says that we can roll or pat until this is about 3/4 of an inch thick. I'm going to use my my rolling pin. If you don't have a rolling pin, you can use a cup or a glass if it's round consistently. I'm gonna get just a little more flour on here so it's not so sticky. Isn't that awesome? I just think that's awesome. Okay. And you want to have flour on your countertop because as you roll the dough out, it's going to want to stick anywhere that is not coated with flour. So make sure that you don't need a lot, but just enough so that it's not going to stick. All right, so here we go. Here goes nothing, guys. So I like to have a little flour on my rolling pin. Oh, so much better. So much better. Keep in mind, the more flour you put down on your counter, your dough is going to absorb that, and so it is going to influence the consistency. Oh my gosh, you guys, this is so awesome. So much better than the last one. I'm going to show you a comparison. I promise. I will put the comparison out there so you can see it. And I'm so glad that I gave this another try. It's so a metaphor for life, you guys. Things don't go the way you wanted them to the first time, just get back on the horse and try again. So we do want our surface to be even, and it is a little sticky, so I'm just gonna add a little more flour. All right, so I'm gonna stop because I've probably rolled it a little. I maybe just had a little too much fun there. But your dough should be pretty smooth. And I'm just gonna prop it up. So I'm gonna use my protein shaker because it's got a good solid edge. And I'm just gonna go around the edge of the dough. And cut out as many biscuits as I can before I roll out any more. Because the more I work the dough, remember, the more it's going to develop that gluten, and the more that gluten develops, it can make our biscuits tough. So So you probably want your dough to be about twice as thick as what mine is. Yeah, I definitely got a little overzealous on the rolling, but that's okay. That is okay. I'll try and make the next set a little bit thicker, and we'll see how they're different. Oh my gosh, you guys, so fun. It's so fun when your food stuff turns out. Not that I didn't get a good laugh of the flop from earlier, but you know what I mean. So much more fun when it turns out. So I'm gonna take, yeah, these are way too thin. We're gonna make the next set thicker. But hopefully these will double. They'll puff up and they'll double in size. This one should be a little better. It's a little thicker. But we are going to set a timer for 10 minutes. And because we used white flour this time, we will also be able to see when they start getting golden brown. And they should stay pretty white. There are no browning agents in here. So once you see the tops kind of start to get a little more golden, you know that it's time to pull these out of the oven. I don't like my biscuits dry. I like them to be pretty soft and flaky. So get these last two little guys on here, and then so much better, you guys. So good. So we're gonna put these in the oven for 10 to 12 minutes, and then we will see what we get. So we are gonna rework this dough for round 2, and this time I'm gonna try not to go so thin, because you can see so it says we shouldn't go less than 3/4 of an inch. So if I'm being pretty strict with myself, this is about 3/4 of an inch. Okay. Might be a little thick. Okay, there's no exact science. It doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. But you'll be able to see how much thicker these are than what the last set were. See that big difference? And then they should, again, puff up to be roughly twice the size. Okay, so I'm gonna set those off to the side. And then I do wanna show you an example of those flaky pastries that I was talking about earlier a little bit. So, honestly, this doesn't even have to be exact. So we're gonna take a little bit of dough and we're gonna roll it out just a little. And then we're going to take some cold butter. We're just gonna put a little bit in between. And then we're gonna take another thing of dough, just enough to cover the top. And what we're trying to do is create a little pocket of air in between the layers of the dough. So if you have ever had those flaky pull-apart biscuits that Pillsbury makes, this is kind of what we're trying to emulate right here. See that gluten pulling apart? Isn't this just so fun, you guys? I hope you're having half as much fun as I'm having. So then I'm gonna roll. They don't have to look pretty, but they sure will taste good. And if you're all about presentation, I could have gotten out a smaller, if I had cookie cutters, I could have done a smaller cookie cutter. So I just did 3 layers here. So there's 2 layers of butter in the middle. And then what I'm gonna do with this is put it into a muffin pan right in the middle. And I'm gonna stand it up on the edge. And just kind of, actually, we'll lean it forward. We'll see what happens. I don't know. No perfect science. Doesn't have to be perfect. And if you don't like the way it turns out when I do it, then you know when you decide to make these at home, you know how you're not going to do it. You can try it a different way. So I'm going to see if I can maybe get one more little flaky biscuit out of my little bit of dough that I got left. So we got one more little flaky one. They're not the prettiest, but they definitely were my favorite ones in culinary school. The ones with the layers of butter in the middle. Right? Who could blame me? So I'm going to put these in the oven and let these bake. And then we will see what the really thin ones turn out like. Hopefully a little better than the whole wheat crusty, crunchy biscuits. And then, yeah, we'll see what comes out from here. Look at that. They're already starting to rise up. Perfect. Perfect. So, yay! Look how much better these turned out. So, you can see we got a little bit more of a rise out of these than the wheat ones. And this is that flaky puff pastry, or not puff, but the one where we layered it. So you can kind of see a little better on this one. So your biscuit will just peel apart in layers, which is kind of cool. And then let's check out the ones that are in the oven. Oh yeah, look at that, so much better. Yay! So that is how you do homemade biscuits. And remember, it's a metaphor for life. If at first you don't succeed, try again.